The cherry blossoms had fallen like snow across the cobblestones of Edo, and the 16th year of the Tokugawa shogunate was drawing to a close with the arrival of the Bon Festival. In those days, when the rigid social order held our society in its iron grip, family honor meant everything, and family shame could destroy generations. My name is Hayashi Jiro, and I am a merchant of modest means in the bustling district of Ninebashi. For 37 years, I have navigated the treacherous waters of Edo's merchant class, always careful to show proper deference to the samurai, who could end my life with a single stroke of their katana, yet proud of prosperity I had built through honest trade in silk and tea. But this story begins not with commerce or politics, but with the most dangerous territory of all, family. The autumn air carried the scent of incense and festival foods as lanterns began to illuminate the narrow streets surrounding our modest but respectable home. The Lantern Festival was always a time when the strict boundaries of our society softened slightly, when merchants like myself could walk the same paths as samurai without the usual crushing weight of social hierarchy. My eldest son, Kenji, had returned from his studies at the temple school that morning, his face flushed with excitement about the evening's festivities. At 19, he possessed the earnest enthusiasm of youth, but also carried the burden of being my heir, the one who would continue our family's merchant legacy and care for us in our old age. "Father," Kenji said as he helped arrange our modest lantern display, "will Taro-sen be joining us tonight?" The question hung in the air like smoke from burning incense. Taro, my son-in-law, married to my younger daughter Yuki, was everything that our rigid society demanded of a samurai. He served in the retinue of a minor daimyo, carried his swords with practiced ease, and never let anyone forget his position in the social hierarchy that placed him far above a mere merchant family, even one prosperous enough to afford his marriage into our household. "Your sister's husband will do as he sees fit," I replied carefully, but even as I spoke, I felt a familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever Taro's name was mentioned. You see, in the complex web of Edo period marriages, Taro had not married into our family out of love or even strategic alliance. He had married my daughter because his own family's debts had grown so crushing that they needed our merchant wealth to survive, even as they looked down upon the source of their salvation. The irony was not lost on me. But in those days, such ironies were the foundation upon which our entire society rested. As evening approached, the streets filled with families making their way toward the temple grounds where the main festival would take place. Paper lanterns cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls of shops and homes, and the sound of shamisen music drifted through the crisp air. Taro arrived just as we were preparing to leave, resplendent in his formal hakama and haori, his two swords prominently displayed at his side. The difference between his bearing and that of my merchant family was immediately apparent. Where we moved with the careful deference of our class, he walked with the confident stride of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy space in the world. "Honorable father-in-law," he said with a bow that was precisely calibrated to show respect without suggesting subservience. "I trust the evening finds your household in good health." "Indeed, Taro-san," I replied, returning his bow one slightly deeper as custom demanded. "We are honored by your presence." But even as we exchanged these ritual pleasantries, I could see something in Taro's eyes, a glittering anticipation that made me uneasy. In the 3 years since he had married Yuki, I had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded his demonstrations of samurai superiority. The festival grounds were magnificent that night. Hundreds of lanterns created a constellation of warm light against the darkness, and the air vibrated with the energy of celebration. Merchants, artisans, and even some lower-ranking samurai mingled together in the temporary suspension of normal social boundaries that festivals sometimes permitted. It was near the main shrine, where a crowd had gathered to watch a demonstration of traditional archery, that the confrontation occurred. Kenji, Emboldened perhaps by the festival atmosphere and the sake he had been sharing with some young men from other merchant families, made what he surely thought was an innocent observation about the archer's technique. "The draw seems inconsistent," he said to his companions, though his voice carried further than intended. "My instructor at the temple taught us that proper form requires—" "Your instructor?" The voice cut through the festival noise like a blade through silk. Taro had appeared beside us with a silent movement that all samurai cultivated. And what would a temple monk know of proper archery technique? The crowd around us began to sense the tension, conversations quieting as people turned to observe what was clearly becoming a confrontation between a samurai and a merchant's son. Kenji's face reddened, but to his credit, he did not back down immediately. "Respectfully, brother-in-law, the monks at Zojoji Temple include several former samurai who—" "Former samurai." Taro's voice dripped with contempt. "Men who abandoned their calling to hide behind temple walls and teach archery to merchant sons." He stepped closer to Kenji, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. "Perhaps you believe that book learning and temple instruction make you qualified to judge the skills of those born to the warrior class?" The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone present understood the dynamics at play. A samurai was publicly challenging a merchant, and any response from Kenji could be interpreted as insubordination, deserving of punishment. In the worst case, Taro had the legal right to strike him down where he stood. But this was not just any merchant's son, and this was not just any samurai. This was my family, and the complex web of obligation and resentment that bound us together made the situation far more dangerous than a simple class confrontation. "I meant no disrespect," Kenji said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I was merely making an observation." An observation. Taro smiled, but there was no warmth in it. How refreshing to meet a merchant son with such confidence in his observations about samurai arts. He turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the trained projection of a man accustomed to command. "Tell me, young Kenji, since you are so observant, what do you observe about my archery technique?" It was a trap, and everyone present knew it. If Kenji declined to answer, he would appear weak and cowardly. If he attempted to critique Taro's technique, he could be accused of insulting a samurai's honor. But my son, bless his stubborn merchant heart, chose a third path. "I observe that you have not yet demonstrated any archery technique for me to comment upon." The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible. Several people actually stepped backward, creating a wider circle around the confrontation. What Kenji had just said was not technically insubordinate, but it carried an unmistakable challenge. Taro's smile widened, and I felt my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "An excellent point," he said. "Let us remedy that immediately." What followed was a masterful display of samurai archery technique. Taro borrowed a bow from the festival organizers and proceeded to demonstrate a level of skill that silenced even the most accomplished archers in the crowd. Arrow after arrow found its mark with devastating precision, each shot accompanied by a subtle commentary on proper form, breathing technique, and mental discipline. But it was not just a demonstration of skill. It was a systematic humiliation of my son, conducted with a polished cruelty that only comes from years of training in the arts of dominance. With each perfect shot, Taro made subtle references to book learning and temple instruction, drawing laughter from the crowd and making it clear that Kenji's education was worthless compared to true samurai training. By the time Taro finished his demonstration, Kenji stood frozen with shame and rage, his face pale in the lantern light. The crowd, which had initially been sympathetic to the young merchant's boldness, now looked at him with a mixture of pity and embarrassment reserved for those who had reached too far above their station. "Perhaps," Taro said as he returned the bow with a ceremonial flourish, "this has been educational for all of us. There is great value in understanding the limitations of one's birth and training." It was at that moment, watching my eldest son's spirit crumble under the weight of public humiliation, that I made a decision that would change our family's fate forever. "Indeed," I said, stepping forward with a calm that surprised even myself. "Education is truly valuable. Perhaps, honored son-in-law, You would be interested in learning something new yourself. Taro turned toward me, his eyebrows raised in polite inquiry. I am always eager to learn, father-in-law, though I confess curiosity about what a merchant might teach a samurai. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the evening's drama was far from over. I could see confusion in Kenji's eyes and fear in my daughter Yuki's face as she stood beside her husband. She alone seemed to sense that the careful balance our family had maintained was about to be shattered. The lesson I have in mind, I said carefully, concerns the true nature of honor and shame in our society. An interesting topic, Taro replied. Please enlighten us. I had spent 3 years watching this man dominate my family through the accident of his birth and the privilege of his class. 3 years of swallowing my pride as he condescended to us while living off our wealth. 3 years of watching him systematically undermine my son's confidence and my daughter's happiness. But I had also spent 3 years learning everything I could about Taro's past, using the merchant networks that connected every corner of Edo to trace the hidden history of my samurai son-in-law. And what I had discovered was a secret so damaging that it could destroy not just Taro, but his entire family line. The lesson, I began, my voice carrying clearly in the festival silence, is that shame often hides behind the loudest proclamations of honor. Taro's smile faltered slightly. An interesting philosophy. Perhaps you have specific examples in mind. Indeed, I do. I paused, knowing that my next words would cross a line from which there could be no return. I have been researching genealogical records recently. A hobby of mine, you understand. The merchant's attention to detail applied to family histories. The first flicker of genuine concern crossed Taro's face. Genealogy is certainly important in understanding one's place in society. Absolutely crucial, I agreed. For instance, I recently discovered some fascinating information about the Watanabe family line. Your mother's family, if I'm not mistaken. The change in Taro's expression was subtle but unmistakable. His hand, which had been resting casually on a sword hilt, tightened perceptibly. The Watanabe family has served the Tokugawa loyally for generations, he said carefully. Oh, indeed they have, I replied, though I was particularly interested in your mother's grandfather, Watanabe Ichiro, a fascinating man by all accounts. The silence that followed was different from the excited hush of earlier. This was the silence of people sensing danger, the electric tension that precedes. Lightning. My great-grandfather was a distinguished samurai, Taro said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Absolutely, I nodded. Distinguished in many ways, including his distinguished career as... I paused, letting the moment stretch until the tension was almost unbearable. A kabuki actor. The effect of these words was immediate and devastating. Several people in the crowd actually gasped audibly. In Edo society, kabuki actors occupied one of the lowest possible social positions, barely above prostitutes and criminals. For a samurai to have an actor in his lineage was not just embarrassing. It called into question the legitimacy of his entire claim to warrior status. Taro's face went white, then flushed deep red. That is impossible. You are mistaken. Oh, I have been very thorough, I continued relentlessly. Watanabe Ichiro performed under the stage name of Hanakawa Danjuro. Quite famous in his day, actually, specialized in female roles. Anagata, I believe the term is. The records are quite clear, maintained by the theater guilds and cross-referenced with the family registrations at Sensoji Temple. The crowd was now completely silent, everyone understanding that they were witnessing complete destruction of a samurai's reputation. In a society where ancestry determined everything, the revelation that Taro carried the blood of a kabuki actor was social suicide. But I was not finished. Of course, I continued, theatrical talent often runs in families. I understand that before your father arranged your marriage to my daughter, you yourself had quite an involvement with the theater district, not as a performer, naturally, but as a patron of the arts, particularly the arts practiced in the pleasure quarters adjacent to theaters. Taro's hand moved to his sword, but stopped. We were surrounded by dozens of witnesses, and drawing a weapon against an unarmed merchant making statement of apparent fact would be a violation of the very samurai code he claimed to embody. The debts you accumulated in those establishments, I continued, are what necessitate your marriage into a merchant family, despite your obvious distaste for commerce and those who practice it. The humiliation was complete. Not only had I revealed that Taro carried the bloodline of a kabuki actor, but I had exposed the fact that his marriage to my daughter was a financial rescue operation, not a generous condescension to a lower-class family. Kenji stared at me with a mixture of shock and admiration. The crowd was buzzing with whispered conversations as people processed what they had just witnessed. And Taro stood frozen, his carefully constructed identity as a superior samurai crumbling around him like paper in fire. "Father-in-law," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "you have made serious accusations." "I have made statements of fact," I replied calmly, "easily verified through public records, for anyone who cares to investigate." The beauty of what I had done was that every word was true. I had spent months tracking down every detail, following paper trails through temple records, theater guild archives, and moneylender accounts. The revelation was devastating precisely because it was unassailable. Yuki stepped forward, her face pale with shock. "Father, is this all true?" I looked at my daughter, seeing the pain in her eyes as she realized that her marriage had been based on deception, not just about Taro's motives, but about his very identity. "Ask your husband," I said gently. "Truth has a way of making itself known." Taro's shoulders sagged in defeat. The fight had gone out of him completely, replaced by the hollow exhaustion that comes when a carefully maintained life finally collapses. "The genealogy is accurate," he said finally, "and the circumstances of our marriage were, as you have described." The admission sent a new wave of murmurs through the crowd. To have a samurai publicly acknowledge deception about his ancestry and motivations was unprecedented in most people's experience. But as I watched my son-in-law's humiliation, I felt no satisfaction. Only the bitter knowledge that sometimes protecting one's family requires destroying the careful fictions that allow society to function. "Taro-sen," I said, my voice gentle now that the confrontation was over, "shall we return home? I believe we have given the festival enough entertainment for one evening." The walk back to our house was conducted in complete silence. Kenji walked beside me, his earlier shame replaced by a complex mixture of gratitude and uncertainty about what our family's future would hold. Yuki supported her husband, who seemed to have aged a decade in the span of an hour. It was only when we reached our home and gathered in the main room that anyone spoke. "What happens now?" Yuki asked, her voice small and frightened. It was a good question. I had achieved my immediate goal of defending Kenji's honor and revealing Taro's hypocrisy, but the consequences of my actions would ripple far beyond this single night. In Edo society, reputation was everything. Taro's samurai status, already compromised by his financial dependence on our family, was now completely destroyed. The revelation of his kabuki ancestry would spread through the gossip networks that connected every corner of the city, making his position in his daimyo's retinue untenable. But there was more at stake than just individual reputation. The complex web of obligations and relationships that bound samurai and merchant families together depended on maintaining certain fictions. By exposing these fictions so publicly, I had violated the unspoken rules that allowed our society to function. "What happens now," I said finally, "is that we learn to live with truth instead of comfortable lies." Taro looked up at me, and for the first time since I had known him, his expression was free of arrogance or condescension. "You have destroyed me," he said simply. "I have revealed what was always true," I replied. The destruction was in deception, not in its exposure. Over the following weeks, the consequences of that night's confrontation became clear. Taro was dismissed from his daimyo service, ostensibly for personal reasons, but everyone understood the real cause. The scandal made it impossible for him to find employment with any other samurai household. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath of his fall from grace. Stripped of his pretensions and forced to confront the reality of his situation, Taro began to reveal qualities that his arrogance had previously hidden. He was intelligent, capable, and when not consumed with maintaining his superior status, actually quite likable. More importantly, he began to treat my family with genuine respect rather than condescending tolerance. The financial arrangement of our relationship remained the same, but the emotional dynamic shifted dramatically. Kenji, meanwhile, blossomed in the absence of constant belittlement. He threw himself into his studies with renewed energy, eventually becoming one of the most respected scholars at the temple school. The confidence that Taro had systematically undermined slowly returned, stronger than before. As for Yuki, she discovered that marriage to a humble man was far more satisfying than marriage to an arrogant one. Without his samurai pretensions to maintain, Taro became a more attentive husband and, eventually, a devoted father to their children. The broader social consequences were more complex. Our family's reputation in the merchant community was enhanced by the demonstration that even samurai could be held accountable for their behavior. But we also faced subtle ostracism from families who feared that associating with us might expose their own carefully maintained deceptions. In the rigid hierarchy of Edo society, what I had done was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because the alternative was watching my son's spirit slowly crushed by systematic humiliation. Dangerous because challenging the fiction of samurai superiority threatened the foundations of social order itself. But as I watched my family rebuild itself on a foundation of truth rather than deception, I came to believe that some fictions are too costly to maintain. The Lantern Festival returned the following year, and we attended as a family once again. Taro came with us, no longer wearing his swords, dressed in the simple clothes of a scholar. He had found work as a tutor for children of wealthy merchants, teaching them not only academic subjects but the social graces that his samurai upbringing had provided. As we walked through the same festival grounds where our confrontation had occurred, I reflected on the nature of honor and shame in our society. True honor, I had learned, came not from birth or status, but from how one responded to truth when it was finally revealed. The lanterns danced in the evening breeze, casting the same shifting shadows as the year before. But the people walking beneath them were fundamentally changed, freed from the burden of maintaining lies that had slowly poisoned our family relationships. That night, as we shared sake and watched the traditional performances, Taro raised his cup in a toast. To truth, he said simply, and to the courage required to speak it. Kenji lifted his own cup, his eyes bright with confidence that no one could now shake. To family, he added, and to the love that makes truth possible. And as we drank together under the festival lanterns, I realized that the secret I had revealed that night had not destroyed our family. It had finally allowed us to become one. In the years that followed, our story became something of a legend in the merchant district of Nyanbashi. People would speak in whispers of the night when a silk trader brought down a samurai with nothing but carefully researched truth. Some told the story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging social hierarchy. Others saw it as proof that even the most rigid systems of power could be penetrated by persistence and courage. But for our family, it remained simply the night when we learned that love sometimes requires the courage to shatter comfortable lies in service of uncomfortable truths. The cherry blossoms continued to fall each spring in Edo, and the social order continued to evolve in ways both subtle and dramatic. The Tokugawa shogunate would rule for many more years, maintaining the rigid class system that defined our world. But within the confines of that system, individual families like ours found ways to create space for truth, respect, and genuine affection. And every year, when the Lantern Festival returned and the paper lanterns cast their dancing shadows on the streets of our district, we remembered the night when a merchant's love for his son proved stronger than a samurai's pride, and truth proved more powerful than tradition. The secret I revealed that night was not just about Taro's ancestry or the circumstances of his marriage. It was about the fundamental truth that honor comes not from birth or status, but from how we treat those we claim to love and protect. In the end, perhaps that was the most dangerous truth of